Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. I'm delighted to have with me a law professor from George Washington University, Mary Ann Franks. Welcome, Mary Ann.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is my pleasure. We come to you on a very auspicious day, contrarians, because we have multiple cases with multiple judges in multiple jurisdictions enjoining some of the Trump executive decrees. We don't even like to call them orders around here because, as the courts found out, many of them have no legal weight at all. Among the things that have been enjoined are a Dear Colleague letter that was sent out to educational institutions with very vague language about DEI, the executive order banning states and localities from using any kind of sanctuary city language or not fully cooperating with immigration under the threat of cutting off funding. That was also put on hold. Mary Ann, there seems to be a pattern here. Do you sense that the federal courts, these are different judges, different presidents have appointed them, have been losing patience with the administration and are beginning to really push back very strongly?
Well, it's hard to say if they're losing patience so much as what we're seeing here is an administration that seems clearly to not care about the law. And so a lot of these decisions would be perfectly predictable, but you wouldn't have thought about them because these are not cases that would have ever come up under a normal administration. The previous administrations, even the previous Trump administration, I think, was somewhat more restrained in thinking that it could simply just issue these kinds of decrees and have absolutely no pushback. So I don't know so much if it's the courts getting impatient, so much as it is courts looking at completely bizarre, unprecedented attempts to use this kind of executive power and saying, well, obviously you cannot do that.
One of the more bizarre ones was an attempt to instruct the Elections Assistant Commission to only accept certain proof of citizenship and really birth certificates, we're not sure, passports, we weren't sure, in elections. And of course, states have a primary role in elections, in election regulation, even in federal elections. And that was also subject to a preliminary injunction. Some of these seem to be even repeats of things that the Trump administration has tried in the past. There was a similar order in 2017 that got enjoined. Are they just throwing up stuff against the wall and hoping something will stick?
I think there's probably multiple motivations here. One of them is certainly that I think you actually have a president who thinks that he is allowed to say what the law is. So I think that that's probably sincerely what Trump thinks. But then I think you also have a lot of lawyers, people who know better, and they know that this is not how things are going to work, but are assuming that the kind of power that they can bring and the intimidation that they can bring is going to have people fall in line for them. And then I think there are people who are convinced that, what is happening right now, these court orders that are occurring are completely predictable, but they're not really the point. That the point of this executive is to intimidate people, it's to harass people, it's to create a climate of fear and intimidation so that even when ultimately these orders are struck down or these executive orders are restrained, the chilling effect that they're intended to have has already taken effect.
And that's what we've seen, frankly, in the actions against law firms, actions against universities as well. There's a related but different phenomenon going on, and that is what some people perceive as a failure to abide by court orders. We've had two judges in immigration cases, one in the Abrego Garcia case and one in the case involving the Venezuelans, in which it did not appear that the administration was listening when the judge, for example, in the Venezuelan case, told them to turn the plane around, or in the Abrego Garcia case, told them to respond to discovery requests. The judges did not take kindly to that. And what do you think is going on there? Is the administration actually violating court orders? Are they playing dumb? And how do you think this is going to get resolved?
Well, how it's going to get resolved, I think, is the question, the existential question for our democracy. I think in terms of what the Trump administration is playing at here, it is very hard to imagine that they don't know what these orders are saying. The idea that you can play with words, or you can say, well, we didn't hear this at exactly the right time, or we can't do this because there's a sovereign nation. I don't think for a moment any of that is anything other than cynical attempts to try to get around what is pretty clearly the orders that they have been issued. So I don't think they're sincerely confused, but I do think that they think they can get away with a lot. Now, the question is, I do think we're seeing with those orders, we're seeing courts say this is not just about following the law generally. This is about the thing that cuts at the heart of our democracy, which is that when there's a lawful order and the executive disobeys it, then we no longer have the rule of law. So I think at that point, this is why we see the courts taking on this very serious tone about how this isn't just about the details of any one of these cases. Let's not get distracted by the details of this case or the other case. The fundamental principle that's being tested here is this administration going to openly disobey court orders? And the moment it does that, we are all cast into doubt about what is going to happen to save our democracy, because once you have that challenge to the rule of law, it's not clear where you go.
There are lawyers who are going into court on behalf of the Justice Department and the United States government who cannot answer the most fundamental questions about the cases they have brought, factual questions. What is the government's position on something? What is the professional obligation of those prosecutors? And should they be doing the bidding of an administration if they don't have the most basic information about the courts that they're talking about in a court of law?
There again, you're seeing some interesting variety, right? You've got some lawyers who clearly do know what their obligations are. They do know what those lines are that they're not supposed to cross. And you have those lawyers, when asked these kinds of direct questions, being candid with the court to say, I don't have the answer for you because I haven't been given that answer by my client. You saw that in a couple of these cases. And you've seen, too, that the Trump administration swiftly moves to punish those lawyers, even though that is the only position that they can take. Then you have other lawyers who I think are simply willing to say whatever, or are willing to show that kind of disregard for the court system and the practice of law, that they think that they can quite arrogantly just show up and keep repeating the government's position and not have to be informed even about the basic details about the case that they're looking at. And I think that that kind of disregard, that kind of indifference to the court system is very meaningful. It's very troubling. And I do think that there are in fact professional obligations that they are violating. Lawyers are supposed to abide by certain codes of conduct, and I certainly hope to see that these are lawyers who will be reprimanded, who will be in some cases disbarred if they have violated those rules.
And judges, of course, can award sanctions for making frivolous claims, taking frivolous positions. But ultimately, it's not they who are making these decisions. It's either at the Justice Department level or the presidential level or the White House counsel level. What accountability is there for them? And could you envision a judge calling Pam Bondi into the courtroom and saying, what is your position on this, Madam Attorney General? Or is that just something that the courts are not prepared to do?
It is really hard to know what the courts are prepared to do, because I do think in many of these cases, they are looking at situations that they've never encountered before, and they've never had to ask some of these questions before. I do hope that there are judges who are going to be confronted with that reality, that if we don't call in someone higher up, if we don't call in the top officials, we will get nowhere. So I'm very much hoping that that is what those courts are willing to be able to do. But again, I think many of us are looking at the situation and thinking this is simply not something we could have imagined happening. So much of our legal system is built on norms. It is built on certain obligations that we all assume that we have. It is built on a shared understanding that the law exists and has to be obeyed. And once those understandings and those shared norms have dissolved, it's not clear what the next state of play is going to be.
And lastly, as we reach the end of our time here, the Supreme Court sits atop the federal court system, to state the obvious. They issued, for example, an order in which they told the government, you must facilitate the return of these individuals who have been carted off to a dungeon in El Salvador. And they further said that every one of these people is going to have to be given due process. The government seemed to still be playing games, even with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, as we all know, has been arguably the most partisan, the most supportive of an egregiously exaggerated view of executive power. are we coming to the end of the road with them as well? And do you think that there are essentially 7 judges, the way there were in that Venezuelan case, that will put their foot down and directly tell the president of the United States he's got to follow the law?
I hope that we have 7 judges who are willing to do that. It is true enough that the situation that we're facing now has been created in part by the Supreme Court. The court couldn't have given a stronger signal to this administration that it was going to let him do pretty much whatever he wanted to do. I'm not sure if that's because they believed ultimately there would be some outer boundary for the Trump administration this time around if they're surprised by what is happening now. But this is such a blatant and unavoidable conflict at this point, that we are really looking at the legitimacy of the court as a whole, that I hope that we would have 7 members of that court that would say, this is the fate of our democracy, this is the fate of the rule of law, and we have to take a stand now, regardless of the mistakes that we've made in the past.
And it should not go without notice, contrarian viewers and readers, that even in these egregious situations, there are 2 Supreme Court judges who continue to support the administration. Simply because there are 7 does not excuse the voting behavior, the opinions, the attitude of 2 justices of the United States Supreme Court, Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas. And I think when the history books are told, we're going to have to look very seriously at what we do when we have lifetime appointees that are simply so rigid, so partisan, that even in the most obvious cases, they will not do the right thing. And that, frankly, friends, is an advertisement for term limits for Supreme Court justices. Thank you so much, Marianne. It is a confusing, tumultuous, fast-moving legal system. And on days like this, it's hard even for lawyers to keep up. So we very much appreciate your coming on, and we'll look forward to next time.
Thank you.